I was just trying to do the right thing." The silence stretched on as Sergeant Tim Harris stood there, his arms still crossed, a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment slowly creeping into his expression. The man who had been nothing more than an elderly volunteer in his eyes, a figure to be ignored, was now the subject of a reverence that shook him to his core. John Miller stood in front of him, not with arrogance, but with a quiet dignity that commanded respect without uttering a word. The uniformed man who had saluted John stood by, waiting for any further instructions, as the room seemed to hold its breath. Harris could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he couldn't quite understand why. Who was this man really? How could someone who looked so ordinary have so much power in their presence? The stillness in the room felt heavy, as though the air itself had thickened, and for the first time, Harris felt out of place. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, trying to make sense of the situation. He had assumed that John Miller was just another old man, one of the countless veterans who had long since faded into the background of society, their stories forgotten. But this? This didn't feel like the end of a man's story. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger. A voice interrupted his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "He's one of the best, you know," the woman who had spoken earlier said. Harris turned to her, confusion still evident in his eyes. "He's a living legend," she added, her voice quieter now, filled with awe. "John Miller saved more lives than you can count. He's been to hell and back, and he doesn't talk about it. He just does what needs to be done." Harris opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was struck silent, unable to reconcile the image of the quiet old man he had mocked with the heroic figure that the woman was describing. General Wallace, the uniformed man, spoke again, breaking the tension. "He'll want to meet you, sir." John nodded slowly, as if he had known this moment would come all along. The man turned to Harris, who was still struggling to find his voice. "Sergeant, this is not just a volunteer. This is John Miller. Medal of Honor recipient, a man who served in the toughest battles this country has ever seen." Harris' mind was spinning, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. How had he missed all of this? How had he stood there, judging a man he knew nothing about? He glanced around the room, now filled with a hushed reverence. The people who had once seen John only as an old man were now watching him with respect, their expressions shifting from doubt to understanding. Harris couldn't believe what he was hearing. His face flushed with embarrassment, and he opened his mouth, finally managing to stammer, I didn't know." The words felt weak, meaningless. John turned to him then, his eyes meeting Harris with a calm that was almost unnerving. "You didn't need to know," John said quietly. "I've done my part. Now I just do what I can for those who need it." Harris looked at the old man, his heart heavy with the realization of how wrong he had been. In that moment, everything shifted. The young, cocky soldier who had mocked John Miller was gone, replaced by a man who had just learned the meaning of true humility. "I'm sorry," Harris said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never should have." John shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's all right. You didn't know. But now you do." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Harris felt the weight of what it meant to truly serve. To live a life of honor without the need for recognition. To be like John Miller, the quiet man who had given everything without ever asking for anything in return. The uniformed man nodded, his voice firm but respectful. "General Wallace is waiting, sir." John gave a small nod and turned to follow the man, leaving the room full of people, all still processing the truth that had just been revealed. Harris stood there, his thoughts a whirlwind, but one thing was clear, he would never look at a veteran the same way again. The hallway was quiet as Sergeant Tim Harris followed the uniformed man, still grappling with the weight of what had just happened. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of the shift in perspective that had unfolded before him. He had never imagined that the old man he had mocked was someone so extraordinary, someone whose actions had shaped history in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. The silence between him and the uniformed man felt heavy, as if the gravity of the moment hung in the air, pressing down on both of them. Harris tried to gather his thoughts, but all he could think about was the quiet dignity in John Miller's eyes, the way he had stood there, unaffected by the mockery, simply continuing with his work. The admiration in the eyes of the people who had witnessed the exchange now haunted Harris. They had all seen it, the respect that John had commanded, the weight of his unspoken history. Harris had thought he knew what it meant to be a soldier, to serve and protect. But he had only scratched the surface. As they approached the door to the office, the uniformed man turned to Harris, his voice soft but firm. "You're going to learn a lot today, Sergeant. This man, John Miller, has been to places you couldn't even imagine. He's a man who has seen the worst and still chooses to do good. You've got a lot to learn from him." Harris nodded, his throat tightening. The door to the office opened, and the uniformed man motioned for Harris to step inside. The room was simple but elegant, with a large wooden desk in the center, and a few chairs lined against the walls. Sitting at the desk was a man who could only be described as a force of nature. General Wallace. His presence filled the room, not with the brash authority of a young officer, but with the quiet power of someone who had earned every ounce of respect in the room. He looked up as John Miller walked in, and the room seemed to pause. General Wallace stood slowly, his hand reaching up to straighten his uniform. "John," he said, his voice rich with history. "It's been too long." John smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "It has, sir," he replied, his voice calm and steady, as always. Harris stood awkwardly in the corner, unsure of what to do with himself. The respect in the room was palpable, but he felt like an outsider, unsure of where he fit in this moment of reverence. General Wallace turned his attention to him, sensing the young man's discomfort. "Sergeant Harris," he said, his tone measured. "You've just met a living legend. A man who has saved countless lives and never once asked for recognition. You're lucky to be here, lucky to witness the humility that so many forget." Harris swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. He hadn't signed up for this. He hadn't signed up for the realization that he had spent years training for something he barely understood, only to meet a man who had done it all and more. I don't know what to say," Harris said, his voice barely above a whisper. General Wallace chuckled softly. "You don't need to say anything, son. You just need to listen. You're standing in the presence of a man who has seen it all. If you're smart, you'll take the lesson and carry it with you for the rest of your life." Harris nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't sure he could absorb the weight of the words. He wasn't sure he was ready to hear what John Miller had to say. The conversation between the two men continued, but Harris felt like an observer, someone watching a scene that he could never truly understand. He was starting to realize that he had spent so much time focused on himself, on his own ambition, that he had missed what really mattered. In that moment, he knew that everything was about to change. He didn't know how, but he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the beginning of something bigger. And for the first time in a long while, Sergeant Harris was ready to listen. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors of the office. Sergeant Tim Harris stood at attention, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind racing as he tried to piece together everything he had just witnessed. John Miller, the quiet, unassuming man he had once dismissed, was sitting across from General Wallace, discussing matters that Harris couldn't quite grasp. The room was filled with an air of calm, the kind that only comes with years of experience, and Harris felt out of place, like a spectator in a world he didn't understand. General Wallace leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on John, as if waiting for something. Harris shifted uncomfortably, wondering if he was supposed to speak or just remain silent. He had learned more in the past hour than he had in the last year of his training, but he still felt like he had missed the point. "You know, Tim," General Wallace said, his voice low but filled with authority, "the men who make a difference are rarely the ones who seek attention. They do the hard work, day in and day out, without ever asking for a pat on the back." Harris nodded, unsure of how to respond. He had always prided himself on his own ambition, on his desire to climb the ranks and prove his worth. But John Miller, the man who had done so much and asked for nothing, was a reminder that there was more to life than recognition. John here, General Wallace continued, is a perfect example of what it means to serve. He didn't need medals or fame. He just did what had to be done. And that's why he's here today, why we're all here today. Harris felt a pang of guilt. He had never seen service in the same light as John had. To him, it was about the mission, about achieving something measurable, something that could be seen. But now, standing in this room with two men who had given their lives to something bigger than themselves, Harris realized how shallow his perspective had been. It's not about what you get from it, John said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of experience. It's about what you leave behind. The people you help, the lives you touch. That's what matters. Harris felt the truth of those words settle deep within him. He had spent so much time focused on what he could achieve, on what he could prove, that he had lost sight of why he had joined in the first place. It wasn't for the glory, or the recognition, or the medals. It was to make a difference. I know I've said it before, but it bears repeating, General Wallace said, turning to Harris with a look that held both understanding and challenge. There's a lesson here, Tim. A lesson in humility. You've got to learn to listen, to learn from those who've been there before you. And when the time comes, you'll know how to lead, not because of rank, but because of the respect you've earned. Harris felt a lump form in his throat as he processed the gravity of the moment. He wasn't just standing in the presence of two men who had served their country with honor. He was standing in front of a legacy built on the quiet, steady commitment to something greater than oneself. The next words were harder to speak than he had imagined. I don't know if I can ever live up to that, Harris said, his voice barely audible. John Miller turned to him, his eyes steady and kind. You don't have to be like me, he said. Just be the best version of yourself. That's all anyone can ask for. Harris nodded, a mixture of awe and gratitude filling him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly seeing the bigger picture. He didn't have to chase after accolades or recognition. What mattered was the work itself, the impact it had on others, and the quiet pride that came from doing what was right, no matter who was watching. General Wallace stood, signaling the end of the meeting. I think it's time, Tim, he said, his voice warm but firm. Let's get you on the right path. Harris followed them out of the office, his mind clearer than it had ever been. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he was ready to walk it with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was part of something bigger, a legacy of service, humility, and sacrifice that would shape the man he was about to become. Sergeant Tim Harris stood in the hallway, his mind still processing everything that had just happened. He had spent years training, following orders, believing that he understood what it meant to serve, but today had shaken everything he thought he knew. The respect, the dignity, the humility, he had never understood the full weight of it until now. He had seen heroes before, but never one who was so quiet about it. He had spent his life chasing after recognition, promotions, and success, but what John Miller had shown him was that true greatness didn't need to be acknowledged by the world. It was enough to do the right thing. The world around him seemed to slow down as he walked back to his barracks, his boots clicking softly on the floor. He could hear the hum of conversations in the distance, but they felt distant now. He wasn't sure how he would face the others after everything he had learned. He had always been the one who was loud, the one who sought attention, but now he felt like a shadow in comparison to the quiet strength that John embodied. As he entered the barracks, his eyes fell on his fellow soldiers, all gathered in small groups, laughing and joking. He had always been part of that, the loud one, the one who cracked jokes to make everyone laugh. But now, standing there, he felt out of place. He wasn't sure if he could just go back to the way things were. He wasn't sure if he could continue chasing the same goals he had before. His thoughts were interrupted when one of the soldiers, a young private, called out to him. Hey, Harris, you good? You've been gone for a while. Harris hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to come across as weak or confused, but the truth was, he was both. He took a deep breath and turned toward the group, his voice calm but resolute. Yeah, I'm good. Just had a conversation that made me think. The others looked at him curiously, but Harris wasn't ready to share everything. He wasn't sure they would understand. He wasn't sure if he understood it all himself. What kind of conversation? Private Jenkins asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. Harris looked at him, and for a moment, he considered telling them everything about John, about the humility he had seen, about the realization that had hit him like a freight train. But instead, he just shook his head. Something I need to think about, he said quietly. The others shrugged and returned to their conversations, but Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. He wasn't sure how long it would take, but he knew that he couldn't keep going down the same path he had been on. The path of chasing accolades, of trying to prove himself to everyone around him. He had seen a different way of living, one that didn't need recognition to be valuable. He walked over to his bunk and sat down, his hands resting on his lap as he stared at the wall. It was hard to put into words what he was feeling. But one thing was certain, he couldn't go back to the way things were. He had to be better, not for anyone else, but for himself. The sound of footsteps approached, and Harris turned to see his friend, Sergeant Carter, standing at the door. "Hey, you sure you're all right?" Carter asked, his voice filled with concern. Harris nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yeah, I'm good. Just thinking." Carter raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying it. "Thinking about what?" Harris looked at his friend, his expression softening. "About what really matters," he said quietly. Carter didn't say anything at first, but Harris could see the wheels turning in his mind. After a long pause, Carter spoke again. "I get it," he said, nodding slowly. "Sometimes we get so caught up in the mission, we forget why we started in the first place." Harris looked at him, surprised. He hadn't expected Carter to understand. "You do?" he asked. Carter smiled faintly. "Yeah, man. I've been there. It's not easy to find that balance, but it's worth it." Harris felt a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time since his conversation with John Miller, he felt like he wasn't alone in this. Maybe he didn't have all the answers yet, but he was starting to understand what it meant to be a soldier, to serve, and to live with purpose. "Thanks," Harris said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. Carter gave him a reassuring nod. "Anytime, man. We're in this together." Harris nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Maybe he didn't have it all figured out, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. The path that led to something bigger than himself. Sergeant Tim Harris sat at the edge of his bunk, his mind still spinning. The conversation with Carter had been short, but it had given him something to hold on to. The weight of John Miller's words lingered in his thoughts more than any training exercise or military directive ever had. It wasn't just about serving anymore, it was about serving with purpose. He had always thought that military life was about following orders and completing missions. But now, after everything he had learned, he realized it was more than that. It was about understanding why you did it in the first place. Harris stood up and walked over to the small window in his barracks, looking out at the base. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and the air felt cool, a stark contrast to the heat of the day. He could hear the distant hum of conversations from the mess hall, the laughter of his fellow soldiers, but it all felt distant, like he wasn't a part of it anymore. He had changed, and he didn't know how to reconcile who he was now with the man he had been just a few days ago. The idea of being a soldier, just for the sake of being a soldier, didn't seem to satisfy him anymore. He wanted something more. Something that meant more. Harris turned away from the window and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room. There, on the desk, was a stack of papers and reports he had been putting off. But today, it wasn't the paperwork that called to him, it was the reminder of why he had joined in the first place. He picked up a pen and began to write, the words flowing out almost effortlessly. "I joined to serve, to make a difference. But somewhere along the way, I forgot why. I've been chasing after recognition, trying to prove myself. But I've realized that's not what matters. It's the work itself. The lives we touch, the people we help. That's what really matters. Harris paused for a moment, looking down at the words he had written. It felt strange, this new sense of clarity, but it was real. It was like the fog had lifted, and for the first time, he could see what lay ahead. He wasn't sure how he was going to get there, but he knew he couldn't keep walking the same path. He had to be better, no longer for the accolades or the praise, but because it was the right thing to do. The door to his barracks opened, and Sergeant Carter walked in, giving him a small nod. "Hey, Tim. You good?" Harris smiled, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. "Yeah. I'm good," he said, standing up and meeting Carter's gaze. "Just had to clear my head." Carter raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing there was more to the story. "You've been different, man. Something change?" Harris hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah. Something did change. I think I finally get it now. It's not about the mission, or the rank, or the recognition. It's about the people we're helping, the lives we're touching. That's what makes this all worth it." Carter studied him for a moment, then broke into a grin. "Glad to hear it, man. I knew you'd figure it out." Harris laughed, feeling the weight of the past few days lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with where he was, with who he was becoming. "Thanks, Carter," he said. "I think I'm ready now." Carter nodded, then clapped him on the back. "Let's get some food." "You're buying, right?" Harris chuckled. "Yeah, I'll buy. But we're eating somewhere that doesn't have military rations, all right." The two of them walked out of the barracks together, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the hallway. Harris wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. It wasn't about being the best soldier, or the most decorated. It was about being the best version of himself, for the right reasons. And that was enough. Sergeant Tim Harris sat on the bench outside the mess hall, the evening air cool against his skin. His mind was quieter than it had been in days, the constant swirl of thought slowly settling. He watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the base. The noise inside the mess hall had died down, leaving only the faint murmur of voices. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that didn't feel empty but full of possibility. The past few days had felt like a whirlwind, his conversation with John Miller, the words he had shared with General Wallace, and the conversations with Carter. Every moment had been a revelation, pushing him to rethink everything he thought he knew about being a soldier, about being a man. Harris felt a sense of responsibility growing within him, not just to the mission or his fellow soldiers, but to the people he was meant to serve. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he had to move forward with the lessons he had learned. As he stood up and made his way into the mess hall, he saw a familiar face, Private Jenkins, the young soldier who had always looked up to him. The look on Jenkins' face was different today, more respectful. Harris could feel the shift, the subtle recognition of something deeper than just rank. He had always been a leader in their eyes, but now, he was something more. "Hey, Sergeant," Jenkins said, his voice a bit hesitant. "Can we talk for a minute?" Harris nodded and motioned for him to sit. The two of them sat at a table, the hum of the mess hall in the background, but Harris wasn't distracted. "What's on your mind, Jenkins?" he asked, his voice calm, as if everything in the room had faded into the background. Jenkins looked down at his food for a moment, then met Harris' gaze. "I don't know if you noticed, but something's changed. In the way you've been carrying yourself. I can see it. And I want to know how you do it. How do you stay so steady? Like nothing rattles you?" Harris took a deep breath. The question wasn't what he had expected, but it was one he had been thinking about himself. "I haven't always been steady, Jenkins," Harris began, his voice softening. "There was a time when I was all about the mission, all about pushing forward without really thinking about why. But I've learned that it's not just about what we're doing, it's about who we're doing it for. Jenkins nodded, processing the words, but still unsure. I'm still figuring it out, Harris continued, but I think it's about being grounded. It's about understanding that the real work isn't in the accolades or the missions we complete. It's in the people we're serving, the people we're helping. That's what makes it all worth it. Jenkins sat quietly, his eyes focused on Harris. It was clear he was reflecting on what was being said. Harris could see that the younger soldier was starting to connect the dots, beginning to understand what it meant to serve with purpose, not just obligation. You're talking about something bigger, who? Jenkins finally said. Yeah, Harris replied, his voice steady. It's bigger than the rank or the medals. It's about the difference we make in people's lives. That's the real mission. Jenkins was silent. For a moment, then nodded. I get it now. Thanks, Sergeant. That means a lot. Harris smiled and patted him on the shoulder. You've got this, Jenkins. Just remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about doing the best you can every day. And that's enough. Jenkins stood up, looking more confident than when he had sat down. I'll keep that in mind, Sergeant. Thanks again. Harris watched him walk away, feeling a small but significant sense of pride. It wasn't in the way Jenkins had looked up to him as a soldier, but in the way he had seen Harris as someone who had learned something real, something worth following. Harris stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet base. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He was ready. He had found his purpose, and now, it was time to walk forward with it. The future was his to shape, not with the promise of medals or recognition, but with the quiet, steady strength of knowing why he was here and who he was serving. Sergeant Tim Harris stood on the edge of the base, the wind tugging at his jacket as he watched the last remnants of daylight fade into the evening. It had been weeks since the conversation with John Miller, and yet, the lessons from that day still echoed in his mind. The clarity he had found, the new purpose that had been born in him, was beginning to shape the way he approached everything. His fellow soldiers, once the source of constant noise and distraction, now seemed distant. They were still joking, still caught up in their routines, but Harris could no longer relate to that world. He had changed. He wasn't the same man who had entered this base months ago. There was a quiet confidence in him now, something deeper than rank or position. He had started to understand what it meant to be a soldier in a way that went beyond the battlefield, beyond the mission, and into the realm of service itself. But the real test, Harris knew, was yet to come. It was one thing to find clarity in the quiet of his own thoughts, but it was another to live by that clarity in the chaos of the world around him. That's what John had done. And that's what Harris now had to do. As he walked toward the barracks, he saw Private Jenkins again, this time standing with a group of new recruits. The young soldier had become more confident in the days since their conversation, his posture straighter, his eyes more focused. Harris couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for the private. The change wasn't just in him. It was in all of them. Sergeant Harris. Jenkins called out, his voice carrying across the yard. Harris turned to face him, a small smile forming on his face. You're looking sharp, Jenkins, he said, walking toward the group. Jenkins grinned, his confidence unmistakable. Thanks, Sergeant. I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about. Harris nodded. Good. Keep thinking. Keep learning. That's the way forward. Jenkins' face lit up, and for a moment, Harris saw something in him that reminded him of the man he was becoming. He wasn't just teaching them tactics or drills, he was teaching them how to be soldiers with purpose. And that purpose wasn't just about the mission, it was about the people they were serving. Harris could see that it was starting to sink in, not just for Jenkins, but for the whole group. The world was changing, and they were changing with it. Sergeant Harris, one of the new recruits, spoke up, breaking his thoughts. Do you really think it's all about the people we help? Not the mission. Harris turned to face the young recruit. The question wasn't a challenge, but a curiosity, and Harris appreciated that. Yes, he said, his voice steady. The mission is important. But what matters more is who you're fighting for. If you don't have that, then what's the point? The recruit nodded slowly, taking in his words. Harris could see the wheels turning, the understanding beginning to take root. This was it. This was why he had stayed behind, why he had taken the time to reflect, to learn from men like John Miller. It was all about the bigger picture. The mission wasn't the end goal, it was the means to an end. The real purpose lay in the lives they touched, the communities they served, the difference they made in the world. "You're right, Sergeant," Jenkins said, his voice full of determination. "I get it now." Harris smiled. "I knew you would." As he walked away from the group, his heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but now he walked it with a clearer sense of direction. He was ready. The lessons he had learned were no longer just thoughts or reflections, they were actions, woven into the fabric of his daily life. And as the evening sky turned to dusk, Harris knew that he had found the true meaning of service, and that meaning was far greater than any medal, any rank, or any recognition. It was in the quiet, steady commitment to something bigger than himself. And that, he realized, was the greatest honor of all. Sergeant Tim Harris stood in front of the window in his barracks, his hands resting on the sill as he stared out at the horizon. The base was quiet, the usual sounds of soldiers laughing and shouting replaced by a stillness that felt both comforting and new. His thoughts were quiet now, no longer swirling with confusion or doubt. He had found something solid, something real, and it wasn't just the job or the mission, it was the purpose behind it all. The lessons from John Miller, the insights he had gained from his own reflections, were slowly becoming part of who he was. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a man with a purpose, with a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve. The evening light softened the edges of everything, and Harris felt at peace, something he hadn't felt in years. The mission, the daily tasks, all of it now had more meaning. It wasn't about following orders just to get through the day. It was about being part of something bigger. As he stood there, his eyes caught movement in the distance. It was Jenkins, walking with a few other soldiers, laughing and joking like they always did. But something was different this time. Harris could see it in the way Jenkins carried himself, the confidence in his steps, the way his posture was a little straighter. It was the same for the others too, the new recruits who had been with him in the mess hall. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were starting to understand what it meant to be part of a team, to be part of a larger purpose. It wasn't the kind of change that could be seen overnight, but it was there. Harris smiled to himself, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He had made a difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of those around him. And that, he realized, was the true mission. As he turned away from the window, his mind wandered back to the conversation with General Wallace. The general had said it was about the people you were serving. It was something Harris had known but hadn't truly understood until recently. The recognition, the praise, the medals, they were all secondary. What really mattered was the difference they were making, the lives they were touching. And that wasn't something you could measure with a rank or a ribbon. That was something you felt in your heart, in the quiet moments, when no one was watching. Harris moved to his desk and sat down, looking over the papers in front of him. The reports, the plans, they all seemed less important now, somehow. But it wasn't a sense of futility he felt. It was a sense of clarity, a deeper understanding of his role. The paperwork could wait. What mattered was that when the time came, he would be ready. Ready to serve with a new perspective, a renewed sense of purpose. The phone on his desk rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. Harris picked it up and answered, his voice steady and calm. "Harris here." The voice on the other end was familiar, Private Jenkins. "Sergeant, we've been talking about what you said. About the mission, about why we're here. We want to make a difference too. We want to be part of something bigger, just like you said." Harris felt a surge of pride. It wasn't just his own transformation anymore. It was spreading, like ripples in a pond, affecting everyone around him. "I'm proud of you, Jenkins," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "You're already on the right path." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Jenkins' voice came through, quieter this time. "Thanks, Sergeant. We won't let you down." Harris put the phone down, his heart light. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready for it. Not because of the rank he held, not because of the uniform he wore, but because of the purpose he had found within himself. He wasn't just a soldier. He was part of something greater, something that would outlast any mission or battle. It was about serving others, making a difference, and leaving a legacy of humility and respect. As Harris looked around the room, his thoughts clearer than ever, he knew that the real work was just beginning. But now, he was ready to face it. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid.